We are still in our series on family formation, and let's talk about something that is relevant for all parents. We often hear that it takes a village to raise a child, and this village is usually referring to people around you that parents can really rely on. Things like babysitting, supporting parents during a health crisis, being there after a new baby is born. But what about parents who don't have a village? And that's what we're going to talk about today with my guest, Nadya Williams. Thank you so much for joining the Know Why podcast, Nadya.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Nadya Williams is a homeschooling mother, books editor for Mere Orthodoxy, and the author of Cultural Christians in the Early Church, Mothers, Children, and the Body Politic, and most recently, Christians Reading Classics. I've got my copy, and I'm excited to dive into that. So hopefully we can talk about that again in the future with you, Nadya. But today, let's talk about creating that village. So you wrote an article that was in the Institute for Family Studies blog, and I will link it here for people. It was great, but it was responding to a recent article in The Atlantic by Olga Khazan, and she wrote this: possibly the most frustrated I ever got during my pregnancy was when I read a tip in a baby advice book that says something like, swap childcare with one of your friends. It takes a village. At the time, I lived an hour from most of my friends, almost none of whom had kids. I didn't have a village, but now I had another thing to feel bad about. Nadya, how pervasive is this problem for parents today?
It seems like it's more so than it used to be. And part of it is what Tim Carney has written about in Family Unfriendly, just the idea that the fewer people have kids and the fewer people have kids earlier, and the fewer people who have like more than one child, the more this is going to happen, because people who don't have any kids might not understand it. And that's what Olga Khazan is responding to when she says, like, well, I can't swap childcare with most of my friends who don't have kids. So a lot of it is just like, this is what society looks like when there are fewer children born.
Yeah. And just to kind of follow that, point a little bit, used to, this probably wasn't as much of a problem because there was just more of a village built in around where you lived.
Absolutely. And the more Americans move away, so it's fascinating to see there are all these statistical studies on how far do people have to drive for Thanksgiving and so on. And the whole idea that the more education you have, the further away from your village you live. So people who get just a BA are going to move some degree away from parents and family. But people who have a graduate degree a lot of times end up living across the country from family, childhood friends, and so on. And so the question is, what do you do? And I think that's what, and Khazan is obviously part of this professional class, a highly accomplished journalist and writer. And the question is what do you do if your career advancement has taken you so far away from any village you've had before?
I didn't even intend on touching on this, but it seems to come up a lot in different contexts. But just this idea of how in today's society, people are encouraged to go far, like even the language we use, like if someone's very bright in school, you'll go far. Oh, you've got to, get out of here. You're going to fly the nest. And there's just almost this subconscious, drive to kind of separate us from the communities where we were raised. And there's probably all kinds of economic and every, different points to that. But it does seem like we are almost driven to kind of be separate more and not focus on staying with a kind of community that we were raised in.
Yeah, and Wendell Berry has written really powerfully about this, the idea of what is the cost of leaving the nest forever. And he himself, of course, moved back, and he still farms in the same county where his family has lived since before the Civil War. And obviously, there are costs to that if you're living somewhere that doesn't have a lot of resources nearby that perhaps a lot of people would like. But at the same time, what are the costs of moving far away so you can live in a big city where you have access to all of the cultural amenities that people really love and the best healthcare and the best whatever else. But there's a cost too.
Yeah. And so I want to get into kind of the what this looks like practically for the family, but just still kind of talking about the different factors that can lead to this. I thought this was an interesting point you touched on in your article about kind of a history of the way different kinds of governments and cultures can actually isolate people and how that's not always by accident.
Yeah, so in Khazan's case, she grew up in the Soviet Union, which I did as well. And so I was thinking, like, as I was reading her article, I was thinking, like, oh, like, I see where this is coming from a lot of, maybe without even thinking about it. So here's a country where for a century, basically, people were told to suspect everyone. Anyone could be the enemy of the people, like an actual title that Stalin assigned to some people. And a lot of this, like this culture of suspicion, the idea that you should denounce on your neighbors and so on, like this is totalitarian governments. But all what it did was discourage any sort of community, village. People were told to just do it alone. And I just read Julia Yoffe's Motherland, which is like, and she also is she's from Moscow. And so she wrote about like her family's history of all of this. And reading it, I was thinking like, this is a history of motherhood without village at all, where people are just told like, just figure it out. And women did, and you can figure it out. It's just going to be really miserable.
Yeah. I just think that's important to think about how when you do live under a totalitarian regime, the government wants to isolate you. And
Yeah.
we don't necessarily live in that environment now here in the United States, and yet people are still being isolated. And that maybe can just help people wake up to the fact that this is not a good thing that is happening just in our culture. But let's kind of talk about again specifically the village and like Kazan's perspective. She talks about like very legitimate concerns that a lot of parents have about being separated from your friends and family, but there's another kind of village that can form, and maybe her experience lacks that. What is that that's lacking there?
So the obvious absence that I saw was the church. So for my family, like we've also moved around. My husband grew up in Maine. I grew up in Russia, then Israel, moved to the US in high school. Like I'm from nowhere basically. But and then for over a decade we lived in Georgia, and then 2.5 years ago we moved to Ohio, and a small town, and had to start from scratch. And so I was thinking of that experience, like, what is it like to start from scratch? And we knew we had to find a good local church right away. And we did. We visited a couple of churches. We kind of like, we had a timeline in mind, like, we have to be in a local church that's no more than 10-15 minutes drive from our home. So we could really plug in, be involved. And it's been the most life-giving thing for our family, because here we were in a new town where we knew no one, but you walk into a church, you make friends, and suddenly we knew 100 people. And they've been just like the most incredible friends, support structure, people who will check on you. Like if you're not there on a Sunday and people know that you're not out of town, people will check on you and say like, are you okay? Is someone sick? So things like that, where you're seen, you're known. Whereas for people like Kazan, I was thinking like, this is the category of people who, if there's an emergency in the middle of the night, they might not have anyone to call.
Yeah, and that's so hard. And
It
just a
is.
note on like choosing a congregation that's local. So I grew up and still live in North Texas, and so with the Metroplex, DFW, and I mean just kind of being in the Bible Belt, like there's dozens of churches, thousands of churches, and you could, throw a rock and hit one, but there's also lots of mega churches. And so there's really so many choices. And I definitely have felt like, okay, with all the choices, like we got to find one that aligns. Just here, like basically there's a checklist and you have this pressure to find the perfect church. And sometimes that means, and I know a lot of people, and I've done this in the past, you're driving 30 minutes or more to go to that perfect congregation. And I think sometimes we aren't really thinking in a village mindset. And it's like, maybe you could find something that checks a few more boxes if you drove further. And depending on what those boxes are, that might be important. But there's something to be said for just going where you live, and because it is easier to kind of build that village, around you that you can rely on. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. We deliberately excluded anything that was outside the 15-minute drive range because, like, it can be the perfect church, the most perfect church in the world. You know what? Like, we're not driving that long because we want to be involved. So, like, for example, this week we're starting to decorate for Christmas in the church. And the committee that does this, they know my kids love decorating. Like, man, you're going to have to rearrange all the ornaments later. But okay. But the point is, like, we're right here and we can do it. If we lived further away, would we come for every like little thing that happens that gives us like so much delight on a daily basis? Probably not, because driving farther away, especially in the winter, is going to be tricky. But this is like, and that's the thing, like that's again that village. When we think village, we think very local. I mean, that's the original term of it. Like it's ideally even like walking distance. And we do have a lot of things walking distance from us, like an amazing park and things like that. We drive to church, we don't walk to church, but still, it's close enough where it is right here.
Yeah,
What a
it's
delight.
doable. Yeah, and I love that too. Just kind of the not outside of just services, which people think, okay, where am I going to go on Sunday or the weekend? But just the kind of daily life. And when we think of a village, and like I mentioned at the beginning, like that can come in clutch when you've got an emergency in the middle of the night, or you've just had a baby and somebody organizes a meal train for you. And those are great things. Or you can, have options for babysitting. But it's not just emergencies. So you mentioned like doing little things like having your kids help decorate the church, which is beautiful. But what are some other things that maybe people aren't thinking of in terms of just like building that village outside of the emergency context?
Yeah, and that was one of my main points in the article that if you think of village as only like something you need for emergencies, you miss the point. What we need the village for most is really like that everyday life. And especially for new moms, if you are at home with a newborn, especially if it's your first baby and you're kind of like, it's really exhausting. It's a lot. And you don't even know like how and when you'll get a shower if your spouse like has to go to work, like which is pretty normal things. So I think of the village as these kinds of things, like just daily life. Like, can we have occasional get-togethers, play dates, like all those things that we need and our kids need? A friend of mine was telling recently when she had her first baby, there were women in her community who would just come to her house and just basically like almost I mean, it's going to sound kind of forceful, but this was a village mentality of like, give me this baby, you go take a nap. And I was thinking like, this is the most incredible gift you could give to a new mom. But of course you have to be part of that village. So then it doesn't feel like weird and creepy. But the whole point of like, oh, this person realized that I'm really sleep deprived.
Yeah. Yeah, there's that level of trust and familiarity that builds up where you can do that for each other.
Yeah.
Um, and that's beautiful, but let's also talk about how that's a lot of people are kind of hesitant to do that today. We live in a very like self-sufficient, autonomous, also kind of private, culture. A lot of people aren't really opening their homes up very much to others or willing like to build that kind of village. You kind of have to be vulnerable and be willing to also make sacrifices for others. So do you think that's harder for us today? Maybe it was in the past.
I think so. Yeah, we have this both just like the culture of not hosting. People are more likely to like meet for coffee or go out for lunch as opposed to like come to my house. But I think we kind of have to get over it. There's the more I think about it, the more I think like there's no way around it. We really have to get back to that willingness to be vulnerable, to open our homes and just open our lives a little. Like, yes, if you come to my house, the living room probably looks like, I don't know, something happened. Well, I mean, really what it looks like is children live in this house. But the whole point is like you have to get over this and it's going to be a little uncomfortable at first and it's so worth it. That's what it is. It's like that initial discomfort which comes from living in 21st century first world country. We have to get over it. And once you do, it really is beautiful when you can just say to people, okay, come over to my house this afternoon. We'll just have a play date. Or can I watch your kids while you take a nap, or like have just a moment to yourself?
It's not the Instagram version of home and motherhood that I think a lot of women fall pressure to today, but allowing yourself to be seen in the real life and just kind of normalizing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to hear more examples if you have some to share of just the way that you mentioned you move around a lot and you've talked about a couple of things with regard to your local church now, but what are some ways in your life that having that kind of village has really made an impact for you as a mom?
A lot of it is just having friends. Like, we forget sometimes that having friends nearby is really good. So what Olga Khazan mentioned, that she doesn't have any friends who are like closer than an hour away. Like, well, you can make friends. That's, I mean, that's kind of, it sounds almost revolutionary, but like, you really can make friends where you live. And so for us, for instance, if my husband is out of town and I have several days of like single mothering basically because he's at a conference, I know that I can get together with friends. And it doesn't feel as like exhausting, because that mental load of keeping multiple people alive for several days without help, it gets a lot. And I'm realizing, like, for some people that's just their default, but you don't
Yeah.
have to do that. Or for instance, people at our church, the other piece of church is the intergenerational relationships. There are people who have occasionally like taken my kids, either because I had a conference or like a work trip, or simply like just said, hey, there's a Christmas movie I'd love to watch. Can you bring your kids over? We'll have a good like movie night. You guys go on a date. Like, that's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. That is beautiful.
And it's not emergencies. It's just like basic thriving. This is what
Right.
it is. Like, we're not just thinking about how do we survive emergencies. I think the most important is, how do we live beautiful lives that we're all enjoying here?
Yeah. That's so beautiful. And I think that kind of gives just a glimpse into the mindset for many parents who are feeling isolated, is like, we're thinking, okay, well, who do I call in an emergency, and not how can I flourish and
Yeah.
enjoy this season of life? Like, we're kind of like throwing that out the window, like, oh, I've just got to get through it. And it's like, oh, it actually could be good.
Yeah.
So I love this, and I feel like it's so important in so many ways, but oftentimes I think this is human nature, or maybe it's just me, but I think, okay, here's something I need to change. Like, I want to implement this in my life. But sometimes if we can tell ourselves, well, I need to overhaul, like, we need to move to a new neighborhood, or we need to move to a new area, or like, we need to like change something big, instead of just kind of digging down where you are. Like you said, make
Yeah.
friends. And I know, again, just like having gone to like really big churches and different things, I feel like it's easier and easier today to technically be a part or a member of something and still be invisible. Like, you slip in, you go to, you see, you're there for the sermon, you slip out, and people may think, well, I go to a church, but I still don't really feel connected. So what are some practical tips for people to connect where they are without changing anything big?
The the most helpful thing we did when we first moved here and joined a new church was invite people to lunch on after Sunday services. Like, just come over to our house. It's not going to be amazing, but it will be fine. And it's been so lovely. And the big thing is, if you invite people, first of all, everybody loves to be invited. But second, if you invite people over to your house for lunch or dinner, eventually they'll invite you to their home too. And so, like, you build that relationship where that connection. And I think about it even like theological terms. Think how many times Jesus had meals with his disciples. The idea of breaking bread together, and also communion in the early churches was more of a meal. And you realize, like, something special happens when you share the table with people. Like, you really feel welcomed into each other's lives. And that's a great way to start relationships. But also, it will take time together. A few years ago, our small group at our previous church read an article about somebody did this study. How much time does it take for people to really connect? And the study indicated that it took something like 100 hours of time together to really form like close, vulnerable relationships. And so the point was for small groups, like if you meet for like say 50 Sundays for 2 hours, like you're going to hit that 100-hour mark. But it takes commitment and relationship. And that particular church decided after that study to make small groups commit to each other for a 2-year period. So you could really build up to that. But I think about this, like the friendships we form with people, like in our churches, in our community and all of that, they grow sweeter over time because again, you know each other. And so in those cases, like you're not thinking, oh, what if I have an emergency? Do I have this like insurance friend basically who will help? No, you're thinking, how do we pour into each other over time? And look what this looks like now. And I'm seeing this, like we've been here now almost 2.5 years. And those friendships are just so lovely and beautiful. Like I can't imagine my life without them now. And it's only been 2.5 years, which technically doesn't seem like a whole lot, but it's pouring into each other.
On the point of having meals together, I think that's so beautiful too, because there's a theological connection. And then just, I don't know, to me, kind of the symbolic providing for another's most basic need. Like we all need to eat. And so when you invite someone over and you give them sustenance, like you said, it doesn't have to be perfect. It's like, that's very symbolic of kind of that, setting that foundation for that sacrificial relationship where you're really, sharing and providing for each other in a very basic way. So I love that.
Yeah. And I was having this conversation recently with a recent college grad who was kind of thinking about like, well, I'm not a good cook. And it was like, and my advice was have one meal that you like, have one dish that you can make really well, because nobody cares if you're always serving the exact same dish when people come over. The whole point is like, you can host people and have those connections with that. And, but that point actually came up in church a while back because some people were struggling. Like, what do I take new moms for baby meal train? Because cooking, like this is, we're getting into like all sorts of weird pieces of the puzzle, and cooking is a skill that a lot of young Americans don't have.
Yeah. And that is so practical. It's one of those things, and it's nobody's fault but my own, because I come from a family of great cooks, but I really struggle. And so I am sometimes like, my friend had a baby, but yeah, it's like getting a couple recipes down where it's like, I know I can do this, or even, making stuff is great, but I've gotten where it's like, hey, here's a couple of frozen things our family loves, stick them in the freezer. When all the other meals are gone through, you've got them. And it's just kind of that, still like that effort where you got your signature thing and you're like, here's what I can provide. And it's the effort of doing it and everything that is really what matters.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So resources for people who maybe they're like, okay, I'm inspired, I want to try to start cultivating this village. Anything from more of just like kind of the ideas we've talked about, or even if you have something very practical, like a cookbook, like any resources that you want to recommend for people based on what we've discussed today.
Really, I guess a crock pot is your best friend, because you can throw things in and it just like, soups are so forgiving. But also, I really liked Rosaria Butterfield's book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key, which kind of gets into this whole...
that. That's actually the second time this week that book has come up. I think that's a sign I need to read it. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's just so lovely. And that's like the whole point of hospitality, like hosting people, but also not being afraid of that. And and if you feel intimidated, just Google scruffy hospitality, which is like this concept of just you serve what you've got, like you're not worried about it being perfect. Just simple. Keep it simple and beautiful. And that's what it is, because this is not about trying to impress people. This is about flourishing together.
Yes. Oh, I love that. Those are great tips. We'll link all of that in the show notes. So, Nadya, thank you so much for joining the Know Why podcast and talking to us about the village today.
Thank you so much, Liberty.